Hello students, Mr. Young here. Welcome to Chapter 21, Lesson 3. It's called A Changing Culture. That's what it's called. Alright, so it's been an interesting chapter. In Lesson 1 we had immigrants coming to the U.S., well, by the boatload, quite literally. They were a little different from other immigrants and not particularly well liked. In Lesson 2 we learned all about the working poor living in the slums and the tenements. It was a tough life, and you had a growing middle class, and then you had some super rich folk with mansions. Today's lesson, Lesson 3, last lesson of the chapter, we talk about the culture at the time. Like, what did people do for fun? What did they listen to? Things like that. And that's what we're going to go with today. Here's a picture of a vaudeville. Automatic vaudeville. They had some weird forms of entertainment. I wish we could go into more of it. So in 1865, Americans, on average, received just 4 years of education. However, the increasingly industrialized nation needed more educated folk, and many more were calling for, well, better education. By 1914, most states, but not all, required some formal education. More than 80% of kids by 1914 were enrolled in some form of education. Now, many people went to school, learned the essentials, basically your reading and writing, what they needed to know to do whatever they were going to do, and then they went to work, be it farming or factory work. The section of public education that saw the most growth during this time period was high school. In 1860, there were only 100 high schools in the whole country, but by 1914 there were 12,000. That's a lot of growth, but many teens still never went to high school, and those that did were often girls, as the boys typically went out to get a job after like 8th grade. In the South, African Americans were still receiving little to no education, as if you remember, their schools just weren't really up to snuff due to segregation. Their schools didn't get as much money. They were separate, but not equal. We remember learning about that. Now, around 1900, education methods began to change. This fellow named John Dewey, he pioneered what was called progressive education. Progressive methods were like hands-on, group-oriented work, as opposed to traditional, you sit at your desk and you memorize stuff. So it got a little better early 1900s, thanks to John Dewey. Now, in the 1860s, colleges and universities changed as well. You had a great many land-grant colleges created by the Morrill Act of 1862. What was the Morrill Act? Well, the federal government took a bunch of land and gave it to these schools, and then the schools, or the states rather, and then they would sell the land to private owners, and then they used that money to open up colleges. That's why they're called land-grant colleges, because the money came from selling land. Now, the big thing about these land-grant colleges, they were kind of a new form of college, and they were like inclusive. They would let women to enroll. Not only that, but there were just more all-girls schools opening. By 1910, 40% of college students were female. You see, like right here, the women's basketball team around 1900. So women are finally becoming educated. 40%. That's a lot. That's a lot of the student body being ladies. Now, African American colleges began to open up in this time period as well, such as the Hampton Institute, and Booker T. Washington had his own college called the Tuskegee Institute. Native Americans began to have schools as well, but they're somewhat contentious, because you're like, yes, now the Native Americans are being educated, but they're being educated in sort of like the white man's ways and not in their own native kind of ways. Now, we have a nation of readers. With more people being educated, there was more interest in reading. So more people knew how to read, so there were, more an interest in reading as a hobby. You had more newspapers, magazines, and books coming out. There were several styles of literature at the time. For example, realism kind of showed the world how it really was, without any sugarcoating. Regionalism, when you had an author write very specifically about a certain area of the country. For example, Mark Twain, I think we've all heard of, was not only a realist, but uh, a regionalist, and his most famous works were The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Were they realistic? Yes. And were they regional? Yes, they were all about the Mississippi River, which is where Mark Twain grew up. Let's see, Paul Dunbar was the first African-American writer to achieve wide fame. He was the son of a freed slave, and he wrote his books about slavery, something he would know a little bit about, and African-American folklore. So he took a lot of stories from his dad, his parents, and put them into a book. Now, newspapers took off in this era. Part and thanks to increased literacy, but also due to new technology, they could basically let them print tons of papers very quickly. The World newspaper out of New York, as others, became wildly popular by sensationalizing stories, creating what is called yellow journalism. It was named after the yellow dye used to make this character right here, a comic, very popular comic at the time, the Yellow Kid. So they sort of nicknamed him that. But now yellow journalism is associated with exaggerations and sensationalization. So instead of like, Mr. Headline like being about, say, Mr. Yund accidentally runs over a squirrel on way to work, it would be Mr. Yund savagely murders squirrel on way to teach school children. You go, oh man, that sounds a little more crazy than the actual truth. So, not a compliment to be called a yellow journalist. Okay, leisure. This is the fun part. So Americans found themselves with more free time. Even factory workers would get days off on occasion, maybe waiting for raw materials to come to the plant. To fill this time, you had Americans watching sports, reading, or seeing shows. Now, in the early 1900s, baseball was the most popular spectator sport. Meaning you watch it. You don't play it, you watch it. So there ended up being two large leagues, the American League and the National League, which are still around today. The first World Series between the Boston Americans and the Pittsburgh Pirates took place in 1903. Boston won 5-3. They won the series, won the first World Series. Now, football was also becoming popular, although it wasn't quite the same as today. Football really started off in the college level, and it was an adaptation of English rugby. The very first college football game was played in 1869 between Princeton and Rutgers. By 1890, college football was very popular. Basketball became popular near the turn of the century as well. It was invented in the 1890s by Dr. James Naismith as basically a winter sport for kids in school to play in gym class, so he invented basketball. They originally used peach baskets. See there, peach basket. Well-to-do folks, that is like wealthy rich folk, enjoyed playing tennis and golf. Still kind of common today. What became really popular for everyone was riding bicycles. But only after the invention of the safety bicycle. You see, the safety bicycle is a bike as we think of it today. Before that, bicycles had this funny large wheel. And then this is the safety bicycle, so you didn't have to be like, a circus worker to be able to ride it. Alright, now, folks were also headed to the movies and the theaters. The movies were popular, as were plays like, the classics, Shakespeare and things like that. But the most popular and affordable option was called the vaudeville. A vaudeville was kind of like a variety show. It had dancers, music, comedy, and magic shows. Sort of a variety show, if you will. And of course, after Thomas Edison invented the movie projector, the movies became popular. They were silent films. The movies were actually called Nickelodeons because it cost a nickel to go see a show. Now, after the Civil War, art and music by Americans became distinct from that overseas. Particularly in music, John Philip Sousa composed marches like the Stars and Stripes Forever, I'm sure you've heard before. In 1917, the first jazz album was recorded in New York City. Jazz was born in New Orleans, but quickly became popular nationwide. Ragtime, somewhat similar to jazz, became very popular, and you can listen to that by this right here. Now, Americans could lay it down on the contemporary music front, sort of your popular music, if you will, but they could also compete with what they call the world's music, things that people listen to everywhere, like opera and orchestra, symphonies, things like that. The New York and Boston orchestras were among the finest in the world, and the best singers on the planet would come to perform at the New York Metropolitan Opera House. That's your lesson. Tomorrow will be study day, followed by test day, but as for today, you have this simple 10-point quiz. So it'll be an all-quiz chapter, but it's a short chapter. So, yeah, quiz today, knock it out of the park. See what I did there? Baseball. Study day tomorrow, and well, actually, it's Friday if you're doing this on time. So the next day, whenever it shall be the study day, followed by the test. All right, that's it. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, have a glorious day.